Hello, everyone. My name is Katie Martin, and I'm here to speak to you about how you can leverage your supply chain sustainability data to drive more data-driven decisions throughout your organization. I'm excited to speak on this topic. It's one near and dear to my heart, given the work I do at Avetta, which I'll speak about shortly. But I also love to see the myriad of both roles and locations attending this session today, as I think it'll have multiple applicability regardless of the vertical you may occupy within your organization. Before we jump in, just to set the stage contextually on my background and both my organization, as we'll be referencing some examples from the work we do with our clients to really ground some of the recommendations I'm making today in reality. But as I mentioned, I'm Katie Martin. I am the Director of Sustainability and Innovation here at Avetta, which means I get to wear a lot of hats, as do we all these days. Predominantly working in our professional services side of the house, helping connect our clients with the product to drive their data and insights they need to not only meet their reporting requirements, but grow their ESG maturity throughout their supply chains over time. I also help support our product development, so get to hear from stakeholders like yourselves on a daily basis in terms of what needs they have from a data perspective and how we can better meet those. As well as getting to partner with thought leaders throughout the global regulatory body and framework creation ecosystem to better address the true needs of businesses and avoid the amount of proxy metrics and busy work that sometimes can bog us down from doing the actual work. I come from a sustainability background, predominantly working in the tech space in SaaS organizations. Again, just helping organizations surface the data they need to better understand their current baseline of sustainability throughout the organization and set data-driven metrics. Some of you may have 2030 or 2050 net zero mandates or other pieces of expectation and goals that have been set by your organization, but how do we reverse engineer into those goals realistically, especially recognizing the role and impact that supply chains play in that participation. So what we'll talk about today is specifically that, exactly how we can better understand, work with, and support our suppliers as they have such a large footprint and contribution to our own sustainability metrics that we're trying to gather as individual businesses. So our plan for today is recognizing that a significant amount of you come from regions of the world that are much more developed than my own. I am based in the United States, so our ESG and sustainability understanding and regulatory landscape is a wee bit behind those of you based more in Europe and Australia and APAC regions. So I'm going to come into this with a certain level of assumptions given the maturity level of those markets, but I'll set the base on what those are. We'll talk a bit about tools and processes to have in place to collect this data before we dive into specifically what data are we surfacing, how are companies using it to de-risk, drive value, and think about future-proofing their businesses. And then at the end, we'll speak to some considerations you may want to take on as you move into kind of this next chapter, as we think about CSRD and CS3D, Germany's Supply Chain Transparency Act, and a lot of other regulations coming down the pike, just to make sure that internally we have our houses in order from a governance and communications perspective to make sure we maximize the impact of this data. So let's get started with definitions. One thing I find in this space is we tend to use sustainability and ESG a bit interchangeably. And within sustainability, that could mean only environmental factors or, anything under the sun. So we at Avetta have created this wheel that we call the universe of sustainability issues. And essentially, this is how we approach sustainability from a materiality aspect. Naturally, not all of these points are going to be relevant for a single company, but we do know from materialities that there's going to need to be some flexibility here as we think about ourselves as a company and then the specific impacts of the suppliers we're connected to. So when we speak about sustainability, this is what we're speaking about. Everything from psychosocial safety to typical environmental reporting metrics to GHG to good governance and the policies that we need to have in place to bring all these things to fruition. And why are we talking about this from a supply chain lens? I'm sure, as most of you on the phone know, a lot of our ESG sustainability impact lies in the supply chain. This graph specifically speaks to, from an emissions and kind of environmental standpoint, how much of a company's impact is actually hidden within that supply chain piece. And as we can see, it can be upwards of almost 100% depending on industry. And we find that also to be true from social risks as well. A lot of this is hidden in not only your tier one suppliers, but tier two, tier three as well. And how do we get insight into that to even understand the current level of approach that our suppliers are taking, whether or not that fits with best practices, and then continue to work with them to improve these aspects over time as needed. So let's talk about how we get there. As we think about this endeavor, and really what we're talking about is getting supply chain sustainability data and then applying it. It's not just that data collection, it actually starts much sooner. And as many of us know who are beholden to CSRD and others, a lot of the regulatory frameworks start with having a defensible methodology for identifying the specific suppliers in your supply chain that are applicable for this level of review. They bring a certain level of risk because of the geography, the work that they provide to you, historical context, etc. And you need to be able to identify them and appropriately apply due diligence to suss out those risks. Now, in a typical health and safety lens, we have a general rubric for that, although, of course, that's always in flux. And a lot of times the major metric pulling that is spend. And while that's still something that we can actually translate over when we think about sustainability, there's a lot of hidden risks in very low spend or what we would think about being low impact suppliers. They may not bring on-site workers, they may not necessarily have a large annual invoice with you, but they contain a significant amount of impact when we think about methane and carbon, or when we think about forced labor and child labor. And so these are the things that we want to bring to the surface to make sure we even to start have the right supplier group and sconce. And what you see on the screen here is that bright green column, just a little bit of how we do it specifically at Avetta, but things you could also just think about more broadly in terms of how can you rapidly apply a risk assessment across the variability of your supply chain, start thinking about building out, risk mapping to supplier classifications, and anything you can do to expedite this process, whether it's manual or you utilize a tool like Avetta. Then we want to think about that supplier communication piece. Again, for those of you with the benefit of being in regions where this has become a bit more of the natural business DNA, you may have less of a conversation ahead of you. But for those of you who haven't worked with your suppliers in this way before, or just starting out on this journey, there needs to be a little bit of a communication channel with your suppliers to let them know what is coming in terms of expectations to secure or renew business and how they can best prepare to get that information ready for you. Then we get to that third column, which is really about, okay, we've identified these suppliers, they know what's coming. Now we need to put them through a level of review that maps to their specific risk profile. And so a lot of organizations who provide this in kind of the SaaS ecosystem kind of go a little belt and suspenders and have a smattering of questions that they ask to suppliers. And we've seen this from our clients too, where you're trying to cover a lot of bases with a limited amount of resources. And so what typically happens is suppliers are getting questions that aren't necessarily applicable to them. It takes them a long time to complete. They may even opt out of the completion cycle entirely. The way we address this at Avetta is we've actually mapped the questions to that supplier specific risk profile. So based on the classification, the work that they're providing for you, their region, et cetera, they get a set of questions that's specific to that situation. So you get to maximize all of the risk data you can pull out when it comes to sustainability in your supply chain while mitigating that supplier burden. And you really want to think about this whether you're developing your own internal system or utilizing a third party, because the friction that you can reduce between you and your supplier's data is going to be absolutely critical. And it continues to build the strong bonds that you're going to need to have for this last segment of the journey, which is that supplier maturity training and continuous education. When we finally get that data from suppliers and we see we have some high performers, some midline, and some risk areas, how are we communicating with them, providing them the direction and resources they need to grow in compliance? And whether that becomes a prescriptor to securing contract with you, or is just a weighted non-financial metric to start when we think about it from a procurement standpoint. Let suppliers know what expectations are. And now that you have this transparency into your own supply chain, you can start to really understand what good looks like and how to usher suppliers up to that space. So just mapping to what we just talked about, I've put together just a little bit of a visual cue in terms of the stages we just talked about. So when we think about supply chain risk mapping, you're going to want something that traverses the E, the S, and the G. Because again, as we talked about suppliers having hidden risks, even though they're small spend, they could have hidden risks where they're not an environmental risk, but they're a significant social risk, and vice versa as well. So you want to get as deep into that process as possible. I just surfaced a little bit of one facet of the risk engine that we utilize as we look around under the social banner, specifically forced labor risk. You're going to want to do that across the different levels of modern day slavery, like child labor and all of your environmental components as well, to make sure that you've covered all the bases, both from a compliance standpoint and from a risk management standpoint. Then we got to what we've spoken about, which is essentially thinking about the space that your suppliers occupy and specifically what questions you need to ask them to understand the risk that they're bringing to your business, and ensuring that you have that balance in place to get as much data as you can from suppliers while limiting the amount of issues that could arise as we're starting to think about the risk that they're bringing across ES and G, and also the frictions that we're starting to see when it comes to suppliers having to respond to yet another questionnaire. And then the last piece I touched on, I'll briefly review this, but essentially, what is the plan then once you have this level of information from your suppliers to work with the group that is underperforming? And however you've defined that as a business based on the baselines you've set with your supply chains, best practices we have from like the ILO and other guidance groups on what good looks like. And so think about what that continuous improvement plan is. If it's something that your organization can message and manage internally, if it needs to be outsourced to a third party. Again, as I mentioned, Avetta does a lot of this work and with our suppliers directly for our clients, providing trainings and playbooks that are kind of mapped to the maturity level. So you want to think about what level of touch that you can provide to your suppliers to make sure that year over year, you're seeing those metrics improve. All right, so let's get now to the space where we've pulled this data into our organization. We have a relatively transparent viewpoint on our supply chain approach and performance, and how we can start to apply that through various facets of the business. So I pulled out actually a couple of exemplars from the business community of pretty much large logos that you'll recognize and how they've been applying this data across the business. Some of these may seem no-brainer, and some may be net new for you. But what we'll talk to is kind of all of the business considerations you need to take into account to really maximize this data. Right now, what we've been seeing in general, and even sophisticated organizations, is it's kind of an extraction exercise and then a repo exercise. But we're not really driving insights and application and learning from it and making sure that it gets to different facets of the business in a way that can drive change. So hopefully we'll start to dig and push a little more into that during the remainder of our conversation today. So we'll talk about this across a few horizons. The first one I'll cover is operational efficiency and cost savings. So number one, right off the bat, when we're thinking about the investments that we're asking of the business into the space, there's always this question about like, what's the business case? And how is this going to improve the business in general beyond being kind of risk management or compliance piece? And the good news is a lot of times when we start to think about these aspects, especially the environmental pieces, that bring down our carbon footprint or our GHG impact, a significant amount of them are actually just efficiency components. So they're thinking about how do we make sure that we maximize loads and have route optimization to minimize fuel burn. Same with thinking about what vehicles or transit options are we utilizing and what is their like fleet mix and fuel mix. How heavy is our packaging and its compositions? And all of these are things that actually bring down our GHG impact and also result in cost savings because they limit the amount of resources we need to utilize to get our products and goods to where they need to go. And so we have here in our first example from Unilever, actually, that uses their kind of supplier code of conduct and their business to drive these principles throughout their supply chain. And one of the things that we see here is actually they've created specific programming. So obviously, those familiar with Unilever has a significant amount of product lines. They specifically focused on sustainable agriculture and created a code of conduct within their greater supplier code of conduct. And this was based on their own research in terms of what good looks like across the vendors it would impact, as well as doing some internal work on calibrating and gathering this data from suppliers. And in so doing, they've actually been able to significantly reduce their environmental footprint by increasing some of those operational efficiencies I alluded to earlier around the supply chain. So they surfaced the data from the suppliers, they found the high performers, the mid, the low, and they worked with the low to bring them up to speed with their high performers in terms of the operational aspects of that business that they could mimic as well. I mean, what we saw this is having kind of a triple benefit. So we see a lot of waste reduction when it comes to the water and the fuel utilized for these products and services. We also see an improvement in the supplier performance and delivery of these because of this greater connectivity to the vendor and ability to kind of coach them through. They've lowered their emissions footprint. And I think one of the biggest takeaways as well is they've saved over 200 million pounds through waste reduction efforts just in the last, what does we say, about a little over 10 years now. So when we think about this, it really is something that can drive a lot of cost savings for the business. And it can move your function. A lot of times health and safety, procurement, et cetera, are considered cost centers. And when we start to take a sustainability lens in mind, we start to see that be a value driver. And so this is where a lot of that conversation can start to tilt. Similarly, with Walmart, you may have heard about their gigaton endeavor, which is really about extracting or reducing that amount of carbon emissions within their supply chain. They actually set up a pretty sophisticated web-based interface with their suppliers that helps track this information and also provide recommendations and insights through a lot of supplier coaching through a third party as well. And again, what they've seen is much more energy efficiency, reductions in costs, a lot more adoption of renewable energy, which a lot of times suppliers want to take on, but they need the coverage of a larger brand or support to be able to do so. So for instance, if you're 80% of their income annually, and switching over to renewable is going to cause a 30-day delay in deliverable of X, Y, or Z, they need to make sure that they have enough connection and conversation with you to bring that up and see if it's something the company is willing to accept in terms of goods and services while they make this transition and investment as they think about their kind of future applications. So a lot of folks are moving to that. I think it's kind of being referred to as well as like carbon insetting. So all of these efforts that suppliers take on to permanently drive down their emission standards versus doing carbon offsets sometimes come with a little bit of a swishing cost or delays, and that has to be negotiated with vendors upfront. And again, one of the benefits that Walmart has seen is, I think within the first 12 months of applying some of these programming, starting in 2021, they saw a significant reduction in their emissions profile, and also thinking about just reducing energy costs all around. I've added in some additional programmatic exemplars in the bottom that you can investigate as well. But I think the main takeaway is once we're able to see this data from our suppliers, how are we reintegrating it back into our supply chain relationship management and our communication with those suppliers? And whether or not we have the capacity to take that on internally or need to secure budget or just start thinking about strategic planning, there's ways that we can drive significant value for our organizations, meet compliance and reporting standards, and also start to build brand and reputational value and have a good story to tell, both internally and externally. Now, that was on the environmental side. On the social side as well, a lot of ability to avoid supply chain disruptions and challenges abound. Here in the US, I'm thinking most recently of, we had kind of the dock strikes that completely disrupted a significant amount of supply chain for a lot of the economy. And while we can't avoid those types of interactions entirely, there are precursors that are sounded throughout the organization and that supplier that can give us a heads up that employee disputes may be on the horizon. So one of the ways we can go about that is, again, doing this supplier due diligence by asking the right questions under the S that are applicable to that specific business, and even going further with social audits and additional kind of examination to ensure that high-risk businesses are performing appropriately. So examples here come from Nestle. They collect a lot of data on labor conditions, including human rights, remuneration, and working conditions throughout their supply chain. And they actually go further beyond tier one. So they ask their tier one suppliers, for the work that you are subcontracting out, what governance components apply to those organizations and what data can you give us on those as well, just to drive more transparency. Because what we're finding, especially when it comes to the social risks, a lot of times our directly connected vendors have the governance and policies in place that we would expect and that meet our best practice standards. But when they sub out the work, we lose that transparency and that coverage. And that's where a lot of, especially labor violations occur and significant challenges. So in so doing this, Nestle actually have seen a significant increase in labor conditions in general. So a great story to tell about the communications where you have, or the communities where you have a footprint, is increasing the quality of life for those participants as well that play such a valued role in your supply chain, as well as just keeping the stability of that supply chain in your business intact. So when we have these types of good social practices, we see reduced turnover, much less supply chain disruption and labor challenges and disputes, and also protecting brand reputation and our compliance from that level of protection all the way up through that brand value piece. So it gets you, for those that are more in a compliance standpoint, to those that are in a risk management standpoint, to those that are thinking about how sustainability can be a value driver. When we take these things into consideration, we're able to leverage this data accordingly to meet all of those goals as our organization matures. Similarly, Nike has actually started collecting data on its on its supply chain, and not just recently. I think most of us are probably aware of, especially through the 90s and early aughts, the significant challenges Nike had with its supply chain from an environmental and a social standpoint, and the heightened scrutiny that fell on it. The good news is, as a result, they've shored up their supply chain transparency and sustainability approach. So significant examination of social standards, including remuneration and working conditions, a lot more social audits and verification, and setting social responsibility targets well beyond just compliance measures. And again, similar to Nestle, what they've seen is improvements not only in the stability of the labor force, but also quality of the product, especially as we think about the benefits of retention and folks continuing to persist in roles that we've invested a significant amount of training into. Naturally, we see benefits abound from that. And as we look at the visuals on the right, just a couple things I wanted to call out. Within a year of applying this focus on more sustainable agriculture and better social standards from Nestle, they actually saw almost a 2x increase in the number of suppliers that were meeting those parameters and goods that they were sourcing from them. Most of that was retention of their existing supply chain base. And some of that was switching from lower performing suppliers that weren't able to meet compliance standards according to the continuous improvement timeline. But I think it's a really good testament that if you provide suppliers with a little space and direction, they're able to rise and meet these needs, become better providers for you, and increase the stability and the environmental compliance component of your supply chain. The second visual is just an example, especially from a procurement standpoint, of how organizations are starting to put together scorecards that make this data more integrated into the business. So when you're thinking about your procurement process, even beyond the pre-qualification stage, but sourcing business, rating RFPs, and also rating the delivery of goods and services in a post-product way, there is a way to bring the sustainability more into the objective center of the business and systematize it in the same way that it can kind of layer onto existing policies, procedures, and tools. The next benefit that we'll talk about from both an E and an S angle is supplier risk and resilience building. So again, this is where some of the more obvious pieces of how this data can be applied may be surfaced, but we can start to think about more of the intricacies of this as well. So from an environmental standpoint, I pulled out Procter and Gamble's as an example, because they have a wide berth of risks. Especially as we start pushing beyond just kind of the GHG parameters. We're thinking about biodiversity now and deforestation. There are just a significant number of levers and challenges that they have to consider given the breadth of their product and the extent of its supply chain and its reliance on raw materials and the sourcing of those raw materials, both in terms of the environmental resources required for that and then the human capital that is required to extract and ship those, which we know can bring a significant amount of risk to us. So similarly to the previous organizations we just examined, they set a significant amount of criteria that they expected suppliers to start first monitoring and then managing and then meeting when we're thinking about the goals. So what they've actually seen is an extremely resilient supply chain develop, one that has a lot of risks and vulnerabilities in terms of the continuous access to the resources required to get the raw goods and materials to build their products and services that is typically rife with disruptions and challenges. I think they have one of the most steady state supply chains. I think they saw a reduction of about 30% of disruptions within 2 years of implementing this program. And again, looking at the social and environmental, this one more so focused on the environmental aspects, but with that kind of comes kind of a net growth around your ESG parameters holistically. When we think about it also from Patagonia, I think a brand that's pretty well recognized as like a sustainable brand in this space. But interestingly, they apply their kind of environmental impact data in a way I find intriguing with a lot of growth potential. And again, a group that's kind of predominantly reliant on raw materials for a lot of their product delivery. But interestingly, moving more into kind of a circular economy with that and thinking about having kind of a closed loop supply chain, reducing waste as much as possible. And of course, this is where we start to foray more into life cycle analysis and LCAs to our products to kind of identify those pieces and add on a layer of context to the supply chain data that we're extracting directly from suppliers. So this is interesting. Again, more resilience built into the supply chain to mitigate environmental and social risk. But what they've actually also done is create more long-term access to those materials. So as we're thinking about cotton and a lot of other components that are predominantly produced outside of the US, there is a significant bid process and a competitive process to accessing that goes through the communities that manage those materials. And so the better positioned your business is to showcase that there are sustainability considerations in place, metrics to be met, and that you'll bring both E and S parameters into your engagement with them, the more likely you are to secure that business and sustain it as well. And interestingly, I always think Patagonia is a fun example because they are a consumer packaged good. Their essential revenue line is about creating products that people continue to buy. But they started to take their data and leverage that into a new business model, which was moving more to that circular economy space. And I put up, one of their ads that probably many of you have seen, which is like, don't buy Patagonia, which is essentially about like, bring us your used goods so that we can repurpose and restructure them. And in return, we'll give you, discounts on new purchases. And again, benefits for them are reducing their waste and environmental impact, reducing their costs as they're able to refine and reuse the materials from the recycled elements, or also just sell them directly, depending on condition, and continue to reap margin. Now, thinking about supplier risk and resilience on the social side, a couple of interesting organizations to bring up. Again, I have Nike on here just because, again, because of the heightened scrutiny they've had over the past few decades, they've actually built some pretty stellar programming and have started applying their data accordingly. But we'll start with BASF, which is a chemical company, essentially. And what they've did is started to integrate these sustainability considerations into their supplier code of conduct. And again, this may be kind of basic level for folks, but I think a lot of times the sustainability expectations of suppliers sometimes sit outside of the code of conduct, and it makes it really difficult to both extract and to track and to integrate back into the organization. So making sure that the supplier code of conduct reflects your sustainability expectations of the supplier, as well as all of the other parameters that you have already included. And lays out the level of data collection expected. This company goes so far as to go into pretty frequent audits, both recognizing that self-provided data from suppliers is helpful at scale and volume and can help you then identify those that may be prime for an audit, both to maximize your time and your ROI and efficiency there. The interesting thing too is as you start to mature as an organization, and some of these aspects we've already spoken about are now becoming kind of table stakes for you, you may want to start to think about coalitions and partnerships, both on a global level and those particularly relevant to the type of product and services you provide. So for instance, BASF is part of an organization called Together for Sustainability Initiative, which is essentially about promoting sustainability throughout like companies like them, so the chemical supply chain. And as you think about those in your vertical and the number of suppliers that you probably overlap with, what this does is if one company within this group conducts a social audit or extracts data from a supplier, it's shared with all of the member companies. And obviously, this allows us to, one, significantly reduce supplier burden. So they're typically reporting once or undergoing an extensive audit once, and that data is shared out more broadly. So incentivizing this supplier not only to participate, but also showcasing that it could actually net new business for them or maintain business and meet the parameters for existing contracts. And then this also, of course, saves the client organization significant amount of time and money by not repeating audits and paying for the cost of those audits, but being able to kind of share this data and resources accordingly and then apply it to the business as necessary. So this is one of the things where as you're starting to move a little more up the kind of ESG data sophistication ladder, you want to start thinking about collaborations, whether it's directly about data extraction verification like this, or it's more of a thought leadership and framework body, something that you can actually represent, bring your own best practices to, and see what's coming down the regulatory pike earlier rather than later. And then again, the second Nike example, this is where we can start to see a lot of value being driven in transparency. So again, a lot of scrutiny happening with Nike's supply chain, and rightfully so. But one of the interesting things that's come out of it is, they've done the risk mapping that we spoke about earlier as kind of stage one of a lot of this work, which is who in my supply chain brings the E, the S, and the G risks, whether it's one or all of them. And starting to map that out literally and figuratively for your organization. Nike has gone so far as to actually make their map publicly available to an extent, showcasing, where different suppliers are located geographically for different components of their products and the relative performance of those suppliers as well across the E, S, and G factors. And this is really interesting because bringing that level, especially if you're in any kind of B2C, like consumer-facing organization, can go a very long way to building trust with consumers, even if you haven't lost that through damages to your brand as Nike had. It's a great way to maintain that market share or even grow it. As we think about the rising generations and the amount of spend coming in the market, millennials now are in their 40s, and then we have quickly on the heels of that Gen Z and Gen A. A significant amount of their concern and their purchasing goes to brands that are sustainable, that they can trust, that are treating their people right, and have taken environmental concerns into consideration. And that's expected to grow more and more. So the more you can move beyond kind of a compliance type of framework and start to better bring real data-driven proof points from your supply chain to your consumer, the better you'll be able to capture and sustain that business. And so what I put here from a visual standpoint at the top, a lot of the work that BASF is doing as well, just through the natural monitoring of its suppliers for best practices, actually is driving insights about product opportunities. So we talked a little bit about the circular economy, not applicable to all businesses, but for a significant amount, especially if you produce physical goods and services. Going through this, even pre-LCA with your suppliers, can start to surface numerous innovation opportunities to reduce waste and to drive efficiencies, both within your own organization and within the kind of upstream and downstream that you occupy as well. So we've kind of alluded to this, but I definitely want to speak to it directly, and that is around communications and marketing for your supply chain sustainability data. Um, as we all know, collecting, disseminating this data is an extremely time-intensive task, and we can mitigate that a lot through third-party partners and tools, as we discussed. But you really want to make sure that you are maximizing all of the value you can on this data. And we've talked about how we can do that from a compliance standpoint, from a risk management standpoint, from an operational standpoint. But now, communications and marketing, how are we telling our story to our stakeholders, internally or externally? I'll start more externally through like traditional sustainability reporting, but we'll talk a bit more broadly. So CLP Group is an exemplar I pulled out here, and you can see a snapshot of one of their sustainability report pages to the right. They actually do integrated reporting, where because we've started to recognize that like the health and safety components that we are typically reporting on lie under the S of the ES and G, we're kind of combining our sustainability and safety reports, recognizing that it's kind of just sustainability plus now, or excuse me, safety plus, taking on these additional parameters. And so I brought this in because I think it's a really seamless way to kind of tell the organization's story, relay your values, and relay progress against those values. So their focus has been a lot on responsible and sustainable procurement naturally, as we've been kind of talking about today. But also just the transparency along a couple of factors that they know are critical to their stakeholders about representation and leadership, and about community development. So their three kind of tenets are there on the left around responsible procurement, social impact, and supplier engagement. And again, the supplier engagement piece is really big. We said, we get the data, but then what do we do with that data? And a lot of that has to do with how we communicate and speak with our suppliers and that relationship management. So they've gone so far as to showcase some of their strategies and progress against that. But as you're thinking about reporting and communications, there's so much value with this data to really enhance company brand and story. So a very significant amount of sustainability reporting value is starting to come from the labor force. And I spoke to millennials and Gen Z and their purchasing decisions, but that also applies to how they seek and secure jobs. So as we're thinking about the rising competitiveness in the workforce for talent, one of the ways that you can attract and retain talent is by having a sustainability story that's hyper visible. And I think at this point, most of us have some level of sustainability real estate on our website, whether it's kind of a sub page of the About Us or has its own kind of heading. But we really want to think about how either consumers or potential employees are viewing that information, and how can we better use it to illustrate the culture and values and the sincerity of the connection to our product that these ESG drivers are telling us, and backing that up with data. And there's that typical refrain, which is no numbers without stories and no stories without numbers. So I'm sure a lot of you do this quite well, and I've seen it done, but kind of bringing in the people element of your organization and telling their specific stories as illustrative of a lot of the work that you're doing on the supply chain sustainability side. A lot of our clients utilize this as a time to spotlight your high performing suppliers and give them a little bit of exposure as well by celebrating the work that they're doing across ES and G that is driving value for your business. But we also want to think about this in terms of, how can we attract talent and how can we retain talent? So if you have any internal employee calls, all hands calls, or regional calls, how can we start to tell a little bit more of the value that we're providing to our suppliers, who are mostly, mid-market SMB like shops that may not have had access to this information or guidance. And now through their connection with us and our commitment to sustainability in the supply chain, we've been able to drive down our emissions globally by this amount. We've been able to support these suppliers in growing their ability to address forced labor, et cetera. And then last but not least, think about your board and your C-suite. Now, naturally, some like top line sustainability metrics or considerations are likely already integrated in some of your reporting. A lot of this was probably taken because top down, someone said this is important to us now. But from a mechanical and operational standpoint, what is the data that your board or C-suite views frequently that matters and causes actions? And how can you start to insert sustainability into that, especially if there is a need for additional resources? And how do we tie that to impacts in the business? So again, this is where going back up to like operational and finances comes into play, which is, we've been able to look at this many suppliers and reduce waste or carbon or fuel, et cetera, by this much and have saved this much for the company or driven this much value. What's chapter 2 look like for us? How do we go deeper? What are the external forces that are causing us to consider this? And what are the internal benefits as well? So being able to start to get those data and metrics into the cadence of whatever channels you already have with leadership is quite important. And we'll talk a bit from a governance standpoint of how you can maybe better drive that. But again, what isn't measured isn't managed. So we want to make sure that we're driving all of this data into the facets of the organization that are most necessary. One thing I do want to speak about, and I missed the opportunity a few slides back, but as we're thinking about the continuous improvement needs for our suppliers as well, especially when it comes to social risks, one thing that we're going to want to keep in account is depending on the geography, you may need to have varied plans across forced labor, especially when it comes to child labor. So for instance, you may be operating in countries where child labor is either more accepted or is something necessary for that particular family unit to have the income it needs to sustain itself. And if you kind of find that child labor in a supply chain and say, we are no longer working with a supplier, what that essentially does is forces those children into black and gray markets that may put them in more danger and expose them to more exploitation than in this type of business environment. So whether you have these experience in-house already to help you navigate and build out those response plans, or you work with a third party, you'll want to think about the if-then logic chain for working with suppliers that may be falling short on the social. Sometimes that looks like we ensure there is PPE of the size and fit to the the underage laborers. They're forced to be in school for 4 hours, at least a day to qualify to work, or whatever has been built as best practice for those countries. And again, this is one of those pieces that's a little difficult to traverse, especially if you're in more countries where this is less of an issue. But actually what we're finding more and more is coming out of the pandemic, there's been a significant labor shift. And in countries like Canada, the US, the UK, and Australia, we're seeing a very unsettling resurgence of not only forced labor, but child labor as well. So that's why it's good to refresh your risk mapping and also think about your continuous improvement and contingency plans in this new dynamic. All right. So we've kind of spoken through some examples of how to apply this data, but naturally it's not something that can happen overnight. And there's a lot of mechanics within your organization that need to be in place to do this. And you may have to approach this iteratively and be patient with both your organization and yourself as you're trying to apply these, because it does take some time, a lot of change management, and sometimes a lot of conversations with folks to get stakeholders bought in and showcase how this actually is information that they need, not only because it's mandatory to report on it, but it can actually help drive better business decisions, budgeting, et cetera. So typically when we think about how sustainability data can be utilized in the organization, it kind of falls into one of the 4 buckets. Sometimes 1, sometimes up to 4 apply to your organization, but that goes across sustainable sourcing, social responsibility, your GHG and carbon footprint, and then general risk management and governance. And so you probably already have committees and processes and groups in place to address these pieces, but they may not be siloed like this. It may be within a department, and there's different aspects of this that you have to deal with. So really kind of doing an audit of that for yourself to start, and recognizing where are the kind of data points that I need for this conversation, and who are the stakeholders, and what existing meetings do they already have that we could potentially kind of insert either a sustainability stakeholder or a sustainability agenda item into. And so some of the questions you're going to ask yourself are, how are we collecting this data, and who's already involved in the process? Do they need to be plugged into different facets of the organization? What is already in existence? What do we need to do new build? When we think about governance and organizational structure, do we have a direct connection or some kind of connected tissue to kind of senior leadership as well, where those conversations are happening, so we can ensure that we keep this on the radar in terms of what we're reporting on, but also make sure that we're getting ahead of the kind of escalating regulations that we're seeing dropping year over year that sometimes necessitate a sudden influx of resources and capital to meet. And then continuing to think about our communication plans and channels that we have to kind of push out this story. Naturally, there's going to be a compliance component where we're meeting the necessary requirements of regulations. But then we're moving into risk management, which is how are we speaking across the facets of the organization, especially procurement, and thinking about supplier profiles and their scorecards. And then moving up into that value creation piece as we think about driving it both into better product delivery and management, and also our brand and reputational value, and how can we build that, and definitely having a connection with your marketing team on those aspects. So I know that was a lot to go through. I sincerely appreciate you all taking the time to walk through this with me. I recognize some of it may be a bit advanced, and some of it may be a little more immature for where you are, but hopefully some of this landed and resonated regardless of your maturity level as an organization, as a region, and the vertical that you occupy. However, if you do want to go deeper, if you want to continue the conversation, if you ever just want to reach out and speak through some of the frictions that you're encountering or strategies that you may want to embark upon, my contact information is there, both email and LinkedIn, always available to speak. And of course, if you'd like to learn a bit more about how we could support you directly as a company, please do reach out. Happy to set up time to speak further. But until then, enjoy the rest of the presentations, and best of luck in your endeavors. Thank you.